Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the Srijan Wednesday webinars. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a community initiative by Srijan Technologies where you can tune into a variety of sessions across the fields of technology, entrepreneurship, and community building. In today's session, we are joined by Surbhi Sriwal, Drupal developer at Srijan Technologies. Today, Surbhi will be taking us through a hands-on demo of Drupal 8 routing system. She will talk about its capabilities, how it's different from Drupal 7, and how to build your own routes in D8. Before we begin, I would request all participants to type in any questions that you have during the presentation, and we will take them up in the last 15 minutes of this session. Also, please don't forget to take the conversation live on Twitter using our hashtag SrijanWW. Now that that's over, let's get right to it. Surbhi, over to you.
Hey, hello everyone. Thanks for joining in. And thank you, Nilanjana, for the beautiful introduction. As Nilanjana already mentioned, the topic for today's webinar is exploring Drupal 8 routing system. Adding to that, I have already delivered this talk in Drupal Camp London, hosted at University of London last month, that is March 2018. And I would be happy to share this talk with you all. So I have visited Drupal.org and Symfony.com and tried to bring the best of both of the world in my talk to explain new things. During my talk, I would start from a very basic level and would try to explain things with the help of some screenshots and code. So who am I? My name is Surbhi Sriwal, and on Twitter I go by the handle Surbhi Sriwal. If you want to locate my profile on Drupal.org, you can either search me in my complete name or use that link on the screen. As Srijan, I work primarily with Drupal, and I'm currently working as a backend developer for Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 projects. Talking about Srijan, so Srijan is a 15-year-old company with 200 plus people, primarily focused towards Drupal, making us Asia's largest Drupal boutique, and we are top 10 worldwide. Srijan has its headquarters in India, and we have colleagues working all over the world. So before I begin, I would like to walk you through the agenda so that during my talk, all of you have a clear vision of what I am talking about. So I would start my talk with a very basic introductory example. I would be talking about the underlying mechanism of routing, that is HTTP kernel. How is Drupal 8 routing different from tightly coupled Drupal 7 hook menu? How Drupal 8 makes uses of YML and controllers. We'll talk about structure of routes, precedence of same routes. That is, what happens when a request is coming into Drupal and there are multiple paths which exist for that request. Which one would follow the precedence? Now, we know that Drupal 8 has adopted its routing mechanism from Symfony. But still, I would say that Drupal is capable of doing a lot more than what Symfony can do, like in terms of permission and role controls. So we'll check that. I'll be talking about dynamic routes and params in routes. And in the end, I would conclude this talk with some code. So if I talk in generic terms, what a route is. So route is a path or a way that is being taken from a starting point to reach some sort of destination. So in order to do this, we may take same routes or we may take different routes. Similarly, in Drupal, a route is a way which is defined and that would return some sort of content. For example, /node, which is the default front page of a fresh Drupal installation, is a route. Node add, which opens up a node add form, is a route. Node NID edit, which opens up a node edit form, is also a route. Many of us who have joined this talk may have worked on MVC frameworks before, and some of us might have got a chance to work with Symfony. For those who have not worked with Symfony, this slide is defining a very basic level of how routing is handled in Symfony. So if you see, there is an app controller, and inside that app controller is a config directory. So in config directory, there is a file routing.yml, which is being placed, and block show is a route which is mapped to a path /blog. When /blog is hit, the controller name is called and method is invoked. Talking about Drupal 7, how things were when we were working with Drupal 7. So in Drupal 7, there was a function called hook_menu. And this function has a lot of things to do. It handled routing, it handled access controls, and all the visible navigation on the site was pretty much handled by this function. So how were things working when we were working with Drupal 7? So there was a table called menu_router, and this table stores all the paths, and as soon as the request comes in, the path is fetched from this table and the corresponding request is fetched. So if anyone of you have not got a chance to see how exactly this table looks, we can do that right now. Let me just show you. So let me just log into my database. And I'm going to use a Drupal 7 database. So this is the table menu router, and if you see the fields, access callbacks, access arguments, page callback, page arguments. So page callback is nothing but the corresponding controller, and access callbacks, we can say that it is a level of permission that is being defined for somebody who is trying to access that particular path. Now let's see what this table has in store for us. So if you see admin/appearance, admin/appearance/default, /disable/enable, all these are paths. So all the paths are stored in this table, and whenever a particular request is made to Drupal by any client, then the path is fetched from this table. So anybody who is coming from an MVC background, this site type of concept is a very alien concept, as many people are not aware of what is happening behind the scenes. And there was a lot of tight coupling because hook_menu was handling all the things. It was handling the routing mechanism, it was handling access controls, it was handling the visible navigation in the site. So how Drupal 8 is different from Drupal 7? Drupal 8 has said goodbye to hook_menu. So if you see on the screen, this is the implementation of hook_menu, which used to be when we were working with Drupal 7, and Drupal 8 has completely said a goodbye to it. So then what Drupal 8 is using? Drupal 8 has adopted its routing mechanism from Symfony, and it makes uses of HTTP kernel. So where this lies in the code, if you go to any of the Drupal folders, there is a vendor directory, and inside that vendor directory is Symfony component. And in the Symfony component, you can see HTTP kernel component. If you want to dig deeper into that, you can have a look. And how it works, I'm going to explain you now. So if you see on the screen in the block diagram, there are 4 things. There is a request block, which is generating a response with the help of HTTP kernel and routing. So let's understand this by focusing on the request block first. So let's say a request is coming in, and this request could be a post request or a get request. It can come in from, let's say, a mobile device or a desktop, and it is trying to produce an HTML or a JSON output. How is it doing it? So the HTML is taking in, the HTTP kernel is taking in the request, and it asks other systems to produce this output. So what are these other systems? These other systems are controller and YML files. So whenever a request comes in, Drupal makes an access check on the accessing user, and if the access is granted, the HTML or JSON would be returned with a status code 200. And if not, then an access denied or a 404 page would be returned. Talking more about these components, what is a YML file? So YML file is nothing but it is, we can say, it tells Drupal how to behave when a particular request is encountered. So if I go by the naming conventions, it follows the naming convention of module name.routing.yml. And let me define each component, each of the contents of this file one by one. So as I already mentioned that I have given this talk in Drupal camp. So I have designed a module, let's say whose name is Drupal camp, and my file would be having a convention drupalcamp.routing.yml. So drupalcamp.content is a route name that is bound by the URL /example. Yeah. When /example is hit, then permission access check is checked on the accessing user. If the access is granted, the content method is invoked on example controller. So here, Drupal autoloading mechanism would actually come into picture that would map Drupalcamp controller, example controller class method to modules, module name, src controller folder, as soon as it finds the name Drupalcamp in the /controller key. So this file may have other properties as well, like requirements, permission, access content, etc. So we will be discovering more of such properties later in this talk when we come to the structuring of routes. Talking about controller, for example, let's say example controller.php. So if I go by the folder notation, it would lie in src controller folder. And what is actually a controller? So controller is, you can say it is a piece of code that is responsible for generating some sort of output. And it might take some parameters which it can use throughout the code and help generating the response. For example, if you see in the screenshot, the content function is there and it is generating a markup hello world. Coming back to parameters, any parameter that is passed to controller is not prefixed by an underscore sign. For example, path, and any of the properties that is not related to controllers in any way, we can say that it can be prefixed with an underscore sign. So by now we have seen that how hook underscore menu was decoupled. In Drupal 7, all the routing access checks, visible navigation, it was handled by a single function. However, in Drupal 8, things are segregated, and for example, if you want to create a route, then there could be a routing.yml file, and for menus, you can say links.menu.yml, for tabs, links.tasks.yml, and like this. So talking more about structure of routes, what other components could be. So for example, let's see drupalcamp.content, as I already mentioned, it is a route, and each route is defined by a combination of a machine name along with a module name and route name. So here Drupal.camp is module name and content is route name. And what is defaults? So defaults is basically a property, and anything that has to be defined as a default to the controller can go in here. So underscore controller, that basically maps Drupalcamp controller example controller class to src controller folder as soon as it sees the string underscore controller. Talking about underscore title, so this is an optional property. And requirements. So requirement is something that determines what all things must be met in order to grant access to that route. For example, here you can see there are two types of requirements, underscore permission and underscore role. So what is actually happening whenever a request is coming to Drupal? So Drupal is just checking that the accessing user has all these permissions defined and role defined. If yes, then it would return some successful output. And the requirements, like you can define a single requirement and you can define multiple requirement. For example, here I have defined multiple permissions by separating permission 1 from permission 2 with the help of a comma. Like access content is separated from access user profile with the help of a comma. Similarly, role, there is a dual permission over here, content writer role plus content moderator role. So plus stands for AND operation and comma stands for OR operation. So let's understand it in this way, that if a request is coming into Drupal and the accessing user has a content writer role as well as content moderator role, then this role permission check would pass. And similarly, if the accessing user has access content role or access user profile role, then this permission requirement would pass. Talking about what we should follow, I would say that role is something which is very specific to a particular Drupal project. So if you are always designing a module, I would say that requirement should be applied in the form of permission checks, and we should avoid using roles, because again that if you are designing a generic module, then it would limit that module to particular Drupal project, because roles might be different for any Drupal project. And we can have, apart from these two requirements, we do have a /access requirement. We can define that requirement, say true or false. So true being, as you know, giving access in any case. Admin underscore route, this is option, and it can be defined as true to enable the admin theme for this route. So this was all about it was all about a static route, but systems don't only function on static routes, and we do have cases where we have to define dynamic routes. So let's talk about dynamic routes now. So let's say /blog/slug. It is a dynamic route, and /slug is the kind of a placeholder, and anything can go in here until and unless defined. So for example, in this screenshot, I have defined slug as en or fr. So if the user is entering en or fr string from the while trying to make a request, then only this route would return out to be true. In other cases, it would return out to be a false. And just to mention over here, it's always that the second part of the path has to be dynamic, and dynamic paths are not accepted as a first item. For example, /slug/blog is not allowed. You should always go by /blog/slug. Then talking about precedence of same routes. So for example, let's say we have this block show. It is a route which is being defined with /blog/slug, and it has a name block show. Similarly, we define another route, let's say event show, with the /blog/event. So which route would load first? So in Drupal, the route that is loaded first, that wins. So if there are two routes and block show is loaded first, so the content would be returned from the controller that is using the block show function and not the event show function. Also, if anybody wants to use entity type, then he can do that also with routes. So for example, show user/user. So user is a name of an entity type, wherein you can enter the user ID, and Drupal would automatically load the complete user object with the help of entity load function. And if that user ID does not exist, then we would be presented with a 404 page. Also, the parameters here they are not sanitized by default. So prior to using them, it's better to sanitize that. And for that, regular expression or any sort of securities which can limit the entry of the data can be used, because that can help in making the code more secure. And once this is done, you can leverage this complete user object inside controller. For example, if you see show user, this is a function, and inside a controller, and $user is the complete user object, which is loaded based on the ID passed, and this object can be used in the code. So this process is called upcasting, and if you want to explore it more, you can go and check Param converter managers. So I think I have pretty much talked a lot on this. So let me show you some of the code which I have ready for the demo. Okay, so here is the code, and I think there is something which is being cached in my Chrome browser. So let's use Firefox for now. Okay, so let's get some hands-on. So this is basically a Drupal 8 fresh install, and on that fresh Drupal 8 install, I have enabled my Drupal camp module, which I have designed specifically for this demo. And currently I am logged in with an admin user. So if I hit the path /example, this example page is being loaded. And if you see this example, this is being coming from the title. And hi there, this is the markup which is being returned. So if you see the YML files, /example is the path which I have defined. And I have defined a role, administrator. To this path, this content function is being mapped in the example controller class, and this function is returning this markup. Yeah. So this was about admin. Now let's see what happens if an anonymous user tries to access the same path. So he would get access denied. This is because I have defined a permission check of role admin type. And let's see what happens if we hit /1. So it will give a page not found. And you see there is a difference between this request and this request. Yeah. Because here I have defined only /example and not any argument which can take /1. Coming back to block show. So let me show you. So this is a path, say /blog/ a placeholder. So now you see there is a content hello blog show which is returned with the title shows blog. So here I have not defined any admin role. I mean, I have not defined any role. So this path is accessible to both the anonymous user as well as the admin user. Yeah. So if I want to limit the entry of the type slug, I can do that by defining slug. And let's say I have defined slug as an integer value. So let me just rebuild the router table. I would talk about this command in a bit later. So now, since I have defined blog show as an integer value, if I hit a string, that would not return the successful path. See, it has given a page not found, and I have to hit a string over. I have to hit an integer over here. Only then it would return shows blog. Similarly, we can define slug in the form of or, like slug here I have defined event as en or fr. So if the user enters any of these value, then this path would be successfully loaded. Let's see. So it has given a shows event. And it has given a shows event. Now, if I change this value to, let's say, English, it would give a page not found, which is correct. Also, just to mention, I have not defined any roles over here, but access true, so it would return for both admin and anonymous user. Adding to this, we can also pass defaults to the controller. For example, here if you see argument, this is being passed as a default to controller. So let's say I hit issue type. So I have not passed any argument in the URL, and by default it is taking support request. Why? Because I have passed a default value over here, that is support request. Now let's see what happens when we try changing this. See, it's changing over here. The value which is being passed here has been transferred to the controller. How it's happening? So this argument that is being called in the issue type function of controller, and it is being used here. Talking about the entity type objects. So as I mentioned, this user object can be completely leveraged if we pass on the user ID. So let's say I have defined the route to be show user. So I'm gonna see, as you can see, this is the complete user array, which is being related to this user ID. So if any user ID that does not exist, for example, let's say 100, I have only 2-3 users in the system, so 100 is probably a user ID which does not exist. For that, Drupal would give a page not found. So how this is happening? Inside the controller, there is a accounts interface class that is trying to load this user object, and you can use this and avail its benefits. Coming back to the presentation. So talking about the commands. So when I was working on routes, I found that all the changes which I am making to the system is not reflecting immediately. Yeah, and there was some sort of caching which is being there. So there are options like to reflect the changes. We generally tend to clear the caches and then check the changes. So there is a very useful command for that. You can abstain clearing the caching and you can just rebuild the router table. So if you're using Drush, you can run this command, Drush environment Drupal service router rebuild. This would actually rebuild the router table, and it would help to reflect the changes on the side then. And in case you are using Drupal console, then you can use Drupal router rebuild command. Also, I have pushed this code to the repository, and you can check this code out from there, and you can try to use it. Just to conclude this session, so we have seen that how Drupal 8 has taken its routing mechanism from Symfony, and how it takes the help of HTTP kernel. Also, we have seen that whatever Symfony is capable of doing, Drupal is capable of doing something more, which is more specific to Drupal. Like I talked about the permission checks, the role checks, and then leveraging the complete entity type object inside the controller. We have also talked about how Drupal 7 was very tightly coupled, and hook underscore menu has to do all the tasks like routing, the possible navigations on the side, and all these things. And Drupal 8 has reduced that tight coupling. So just to sum it up all, uh, we can define routes, we can define dynamic routes, we can sanitize the values of these routes by using regex expressions, and we can make the code more secure. So I think this is all about from my side. Over to you, Nilanjana.
Thanks, Surbhi, for taking us through that hands-on session. And right now, if our attendees have any questions, now is the time to type them in, and I can take them up with Surbhi, and she can sort of answer your questions and give you a better view and a better understanding of Drupal 8 routes. So right now, I'm just going to take up a couple of questions that I already have here. One is in terms of so you said Drupal 8 takes its routing system from Symfony, and it can do a lot more than what Symfony can do. So if you could just maybe elaborate on that point a little bit, that what exact tasks it is that Drupal 8 routes can accomplish that Symfony doesn't really sort of support or not able to do with Symfony.
Yeah, so talking specifically in terms of what Drupal 8 can do more, and as I mentioned that when I was preparing this talk, I went through the Drupal.org documentation as well as documentation that is available on Symfony.com. So I found that Drupal is much more stronger when it comes to leveraging entity type objects. As I mentioned, you can get the complete control of $user object and things like that. We can also design routes which are focused around using more of a role-based permission checks and more of a permission-based check. Like we can define checks on admin roles, on content writer roles, and we can define various permission checks like access content checks. So this is something which is specific to Drupal and which is available more in terms of Drupal, I can say.
Okay, that's great. So another question that I have here is that since Drupal 8 no longer has the hook menu system, does that bring with it any sort of drawbacks in Drupal 8? Is there anything at all that the hook menu could do that sort of is now more challenging because of the absence of hook menu in Drupal 8?
So basically, I have not seen any sort of drawback, because anything that was available in hook underscore menu, that is pretty much available in Drupal 8. Only the thing is that the structure has been more towards the MVC and towards the object, defining controllers and keeping the code sanitized in form of YML files and in terms of controllers. So I don't think there is a drawback. In fact, I see that it's an advantage that it has separated things out and it has make things more clear. And also I would say that it has reduced the tight coupling that was with hook underscore menu.
Okay, so another question that I have got here is that if you could elaborate on the topic of precedence of two similar URLs.
Okay,
And
so
which one
talking.
sort of take place first, and what determines which URL takes place first?
Okay, sure. So precedence, I was talking to elaborate more. So let's say there is route 1, which is blog/slug, and it is defined by the route name. Let's say blog show. Yeah, and there is another route which is, let's say, blog/event, and it is defined by event show. So if I have defined these both of these routes in the system, so if anybody is hitting a request, let's say blog/test, then it's pretty much a surety that this type of request is returned true for both of these routes until and unless there is some sort of specific access check or some sort of limiting the slug or the event form of a thing is defined. So in that case, the route that is loaded first would take the precedence over the another route, and we can to get rid of this, we can always try and limiting the inputs which we are requesting from the user, so that at any given time only one route loads.
Okay, okay, all right. Another question that I have here is that um, uh, could you sort of dive a little bit deeper or sort of take us through the dynamic routing structures once again through that portion of your talk?
Yeah, sure. Let me just switch to that slide. Okay, so this is the one. So I was saying that dynamic routes can be defined in a way like I have slug, which is in the form of a placeholder, and /blog/slug. So /slug being a placeholder, until and unless I have limited the value of slug, it is more of a wildcard type of an argument. So it happens to be dynamic over here. So block show, uh, that would be a method that would take in this dynamic argument and use it along. So I had a type of demo here like issue type, and so I have passed a default value over here. So if you see, I I can change this argument from the URL. Like I have given the type bug. I can also give the type test. Yeah, I can. So this portion is continuously changing, and hence it happens to be dynamic.
Okay, thanks, Surbhi. Um, Also, I think another question or query that I have received here is that I think in the beginning of the session you used this term called upcasting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so could you maybe take us through the example of that once again, if possible?
Yeah, sure. So I was talking about upcasting. So I said that this if anybody wants to use the complete user object, that can be used in a way like I have defined show user function over here, and if I hit the ID, so the complete user object is available over here. So if you see, this is the name, this is the argument which is being input, and $user, which is the name of an entity type, is completely available in the controller. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, Surbhi, that I think that adequately answers the question. Yes. Okay, so I think we're sort of nearing the end of our session, and if any of our attendees still have any questions for Surbhi, now would be the time to type them in. And while we wait for any more questions to come in, I would just like to ask Surbhi, for somebody who's getting started with D8, and as you said, people who have already used the MVC concept might not be familiar with how a couple of things are done in D8. So for them who are just starting with Drupal 8 and just they're starting with D8 routes, what is it that you would sort of advise them to keep in mind while working or structuring D8 routes?
Yeah, so I would say that structuring D8 routes to sum everything up, I think you should be more clear on what type of route you want to create. Like if you want to have a dynamic or you want to have a static route, then maybe you have to map it to a particular path, and then you would have to segregate your code between the YML file and the controller file, because these two are the very important component that would help in routing. So in YML, maybe you would like to define your paths, and you would like to invoke your method, and in the controller section you would be more of concerned about the logic part and returning the response type of the thing.
Okay, all right. I think in the meanwhile, we have gotten another question here, which is, can we set the precedence of URLs through our code, like in routing.yml files?
So I don't clearly remember if there is an exact property for that, but I think we can definitely, limit the type of inputs.
Okay, all right. I hope that answers the question for our attendee. And yeah, I think we'll wait for just about another couple of minutes to see if there are any more questions coming in. And till then, Surbhi, if you would sort of like to sum up, or if you have any closing comments, maybe that now would be a good time.
Yeah, sure. So I think I have talked pretty much everything about it.
Okay, great. So I think, yeah, I do think that was all the questions that we had. And so I would like to thank Surbhi, first of all, for joining us today and taking us through that hands-on demo and a very interesting and insightful session. And I would like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today for the session. And I hope to definitely see you at our next webinar. And so with that, that is all we have for tonight. And thank you all once again for joining us today.
Thank you.